nor is it desirable, because all said and done, it's an allegory. So the protagonist is an animal with the attribute of burrowing. So one could safely say it is a rodent, albeit a restless one. This animal has two features. It digs with its strong forehead and powerful claws. So these are the two attributes. It has a strong forehead and it has powerful claws. So with the strong forehead, it digs, it removes, and the loose soil is kind of put aside, pulled out with the claws, and also with the strong forehead, it can harden the walls of the tunnels that he's making. And the claws, of course, they help him to excavate the loose soil to throw it out. Now, possessed with the idea of a perfect house, the animal sweats, slogs, and suffers. That is his mission of life, to make a perfect dwelling. It spends its entire youth making a burrow, a labyrinth of zigzag, interconnected tunnels deep inside the earth, where it can live comfortably, safely, enjoying its peace and tranquility. What is the topography of the burrow? A great deal of physical and intellectual labor has gone into the architectural design and the construction of the burrow. The animal is the mason, the engineer, and the architect. So he's all in one. The digging through the loose soil is carried out with painstaking scratching, biting, pounding, and hammering. Indeed, the animal has worked with single-minded dedication and devotion to make a success of this structure. This structure is a product of its blood and sweat. It must keep away all its opponents, enemies. Second important thing is that this burrow must be fortified against noise. Thus, the animal makes all kinds of tedious calculations. Like an engineer, he makes all tedious calculations about the feasibility of the tunnels. Should his supplies be stored at one place or distributed in the tunnels? How should the entrance be constructed? It has to be safe. At the same time, it has to connect also, it has to obstruct also. In this manner, it goes back and forth with its decisions. It takes a childlike delight in the tunnels and the plazas of the burrow. The narrative opens with a self-congratulating soliloquy. I have completed the construction of my burrow, and it seems to be successful. At this point, I'd like to mention that although Kafka never wrote plays, yet many of his stories have been dramatized. Even Metamorphosis has been dramatized. It's a one-person play, if one can call it a play, but somehow they are popular with the dramatizations. And this one, The Burrow, I had a few years ago, there was a French musical in Delhi, and it had been performed again by a single actor. And that's how I got, in fact, introduced to this narrative. There is you might be knowing there's right now a case going on in Israel. Who should keep the manuscripts of Kafka? Should it be Israel, because Kafka is a Jewish writer, or should Germans keep it in their libraries because he was a German writer? So both sides are arguing that case. And well, I thought it should be the French who should keep the manuscripts, because it is ultimately the French who discovered Kafka. So these are interesting anecdotes that there is a trial over Kafka's manuscripts today. The author who himself wrote a book called The Trial. Yeah. So how does this space unfold? The space inside is divided into a labyrinth of tunnels, more than 50, with round spacious plazas at every few meters. In the heart of the burrow is the carefully chosen castle keep, where all the meat stores are piled up. This is by far the most important section of the house, so to say, the animal's kitchen, where it allows itself to indulge. Sometimes the creature lies down and rolls about it with pure joy, smiles satisfied, or curls up in comfort. These are his, so to say, happy hours where he chooses between dozing and unconscious sleep and pampers himself with the nourishment of his choice. The burrow is subjected to periodic reviews, invariably leading to some repairs and renovations conducted with a great deal of zest and zeal. Tremendous amount of technical considerations go into the pros and cons of each modification. Once in a while, this creature is forced to venture out on hunting expeditions. It has to replenish its stocks, but it does so most reluctantly. It always returns anxiously to its dwelling, where it recuperates from exhaustion and exertion. Sometimes this animal likes to sit outside of his burrow at a distance from it so that it can keep an eye on the entrance where it is vulnerable, as it is just covered by moss. It monitors the traffic around it and looks around for any suspicious activity. The burrow is his sanctuary. It protects him from the outside world, and in turn, this animal protects the burrow. In fact, it keeps saying, "This is my house," but both seem to need each other. He protects the burrow, and the burrow protects him. However, the animal cannot rid himself of dark premonitions. He is anxious that the burrow has some weak points, some drawbacks. Pride in the burrow slowly gives way to doubt. In the middle of the story, after about 18 pages or so, there is a dramatic twist in the narration. In spite of all its vigilance and safeguards, the animal starts hearing faint noises through the walls. These noises are described sometimes as hissing, sometimes as whistling, or a rustle, and they are hard to trace. The creature keeps investigating the source of knocking, and this causes him considerable angst. He presses his ears against the walls to detect the source. He digs frantically through the walls, but the noises persist. He never comes face to face with the enemy, but the persistence of noises in the fortress agitates and alarms him, for it undermines his sense of security. He feels nervous to the extent of paranoia. He asks himself, is it just one animal? Or are there many animals, small animals, attacking his burrow? Or could it be that it's just the sound of a water pipe? And then he asks himself, was all his effort of the youth in vain? So the very purpose of the burrow, a place where he could live in peace, where he could live as he deems fit, is rendered null and void. His world falls apart. The last line says it all. I quote, "But all remained unchanged. That the sentence is left incomplete. The story is a fragment. So the plan of a completely perfect burrow goes awry and the task remains unfulfilled. His initial euphoria vanishes and he concedes distraught that his planning had drawbacks, which he had overlooked. So here, like I said, the narrative breaks off. Now, I come to the interpretation of this story. Now, this narrative has somehow not got the attention it deserves in research on Kafka. There are some standard interpretations that equate the animal with the writer, that this is Kafka himself. The burrow is Kafka's diseased body. Like I said, he had TB, and the tunnels are his represent his respiratory tract, and the haunting knocking is his tuberculosis cuff. So the burrow is the animal is an alter ego for the writer Kafka. Now, such interpretations in which the work of an artist is treated as self-portrait, they are quite popular. However, I feel they are reductionist in nature, with little or no significance for the universal human condition. It is biography becomes a kind of hagiography. You just talk about his life and try to find Kafka's problems in the works, but the work itself remains neglected. Also, it's a kind of caricature that Kafka would only write about his tuberculosis. It's just too simplistic for me. As I would see it, the narrative provides us with an allegory for mental space of a being where he enjoys the calm and protection from the world outside. It is a sanctuary, his refuge, where he would be free of angst. The chambers can be interpreted as a creative space of memory, imagination, thoughts, fantasies, and dreams from which a being ultimately draws his nourishment. He can play around with his ideas, with his imagination. He can fool around with them. He can enjoy them. He can pamper himself with them. This being takes pride in the burrow and cherishes every bit of it. He repeats several times, "My house. I possess a house. I am in my own house. Nothing can part us for wrong. You belong to me. I to you. We are united." The relation of the being with the burrow is existential. In this burrow, the animal fortified himself from the outside world, but in the process, he had also locked himself in. And this is the inevitable Kafkan paradox, the Kafkan trap. The project of a perfect dwelling remains unfulfilled. The story also remains incomplete, although that does not really irritate the reader. The incomplete nature of the story dovetails with the incomplete project and the impossibility of a way out of this existential impasse. I mentioned this German term Angst is at best rendered in original. It means anxiety and dread, but there's no exact equivalent to it. So I would add today that angst is also intransitive. It doesn't have an object. This is what Heidegger had said, that like in German you say, "I have angst." So what of is not important. I have angst. It can be without object. It's a feeling. It's a state of agitation and apprehension in the world around us. The German word finds its way into the narrative. It is used several times and used by the first-person narrator. Outside this very private and intimate space of the self lurks danger. The other is by definition an intruder, a trespasser, who has to be kept out at all costs. Even if he manages to enter, he must be evicted. Fencing of this space is important as sharing this space with another, even a visitor or someone of his own kind, is out of question. Simply because this space, even if it is infinite, is not meant for two people. No burrow is large enough to accommodate two people. This reminds me of Sartre's play, No Exit. Again, last time also I referred to it because Sartre's idea in No Exit is that hell is where when you are stuck with people you don't like. And there's no exit out of it because all said and done, that's hell. So, and this is also this, not same I would say, but a similar kind of thought that you cannot live with anyone. Your burrow can only be for you. Now this space is for the animal sacrosanct, sacred, and it cannot be violated. But at the same time, something is not right because the animal starts hearing noises. These are not loud noises, these are faint noises. This loner by choice, he's not lonely, mind you. I'm calling him a loner. He seems paradoxically in need of some kind of social contact with the other. And this explains the noises, real or imaginary, and his obsession with an intruder. Similarly, the entrance divides, but it also connects. It can betray, but it can also save. After a long spell of detachment, the animal seems to need, or it seeks, some attachment, and this game of detachment and attachment alternates in his life. It is as if two forces are engaged in a combat. At times, the being is seized with angst and he wrestles with an invisible intruder. In other words, the being can neither live with the other nor without the other. Neither with nor without the other. At the same time, he also wrestles with his own anxieties, and that is the existential dilemma. It seems as if there's a psychological warfare within the creature where he is wrestling with the other as well as with his own selves that are working at cross purposes. In this unending relation and non-relation, one is never sure of oneself. The story is thus a presentation of human contradictions and psychic complexities. Its truth is valid for all times, present, past, and future. All beings have their respective burrows, but what one does with it is up to the individual. This being supplies his nourishment, as he calls it, are prouder and richer in content than those of the ordinary mortals. This he claims. But the digging creature also has a sensibility that is acute. Artists live in their respective burrows where their creativity flourishes. At the same time, this burrow is always in a flux. It is never complete. The inner space may define freedom and free will, but in the Kafkan world, that too is an illusion. So that's where I would say Camus and Kafka are very different, because Camus' absurd hero is somewhat happy in the sense that he's neither happy nor sad. So he's, whereas the Kafkan hero is always restless, always anxious. Now, a few words about the trope of digging. This is a motive, a trope attributed to the Romantic epoch. It refers to self-exploration, boring deep into the self, and then perhaps creating something aesthetic out of it. Burrowing literally involves digging out or removing material, the opposite of building a structure over the earth. It's a form of excavation, like an archaeologist. Then lastly, I come to the term Kafkaesque. This is an adjective from Kafkaesque. So it refers to existential situations where the protagonist, often naive, uncertain, disoriented, is caught in a labyrinth, a mad world that sucks him, and he finds no way out. There is no hope for the Kafkan hero. There are no windows for relief. He feels anxiety and dread all the time. These situations create a chilling, stifling, claustrophobic kind of ambience that is termed Kafkaesque. There is mixing of the realist and fantastic, or the natural and the supernatural, the absurd and the logical, the tragic and the comic. This topsy-turvy Kafkan world is a dense, rather condensed metaphor for the enigma that is human existence. The existential issues, who am I and how do I stand in relation to others, remains unresolved and elusive. Yet there is a constant and endless search for this incomprehensible truth. This search becomes a wild goose chase that engulfs the characters without their necessarily realizing what is going on. The action takes place in a universe that resembles none of our familiar worlds. It is an abstract world. At the same time, it corresponds to the real world. Readers from different cultures and regions of the world can relate to it because within the complexities of the surrealistic world and universe are integrated the possibilities of human existence. The Burrow is, in that sense, a highly charged existential narrative. Now I come to the second part of my presentation, and that is that will not take so long. I thought I would try to show you some artists who are inspired by Kafka, who are influenced by Kafka within India. So a little bit of Indian context. I have a PowerPoint presentation. It refers more to. I mean, there's no great influence of Kafka in India, but there is some influence among the intellectual circles. So that is what I would like to show. Please give me 1 minute. Hello. Excuse me. Vicky. I'm sorry, I'm having some problems. Just give me 1 minute. So,
Rosie, there is a space called present now there. Click on that.
I clicked on that now.
Present, you click on that. You say your entire screen. Click on entire screen. After you click on that, there is your entire screen. Did you click on present now? When you click on present now, you will have 3 things that crop up. Your entire screen, a window, a Chrome tab.
Present now. Okay.
You just click on your entire screen.
Yeah, I'm doing now window.
Don't want the window, do the entire screen.
I think I have to wait now for the documents to.
Yeah,
Or
you
not.
wait. Yeah, after that it
Yeah,
will
yeah.
come.
Click here. Yeah. Is it visible?
Not yet.
Not yet. You also need to click on share. First, you click on the small screen that appears, and then the share will be activated. You click on that. Only after
Yeah,
that
yeah.
will be
But
able
I'm
to see.
waiting for the document to appear. I think I'll do that. It's not visible now.
No, no, no.
Just let's wait. It's here. Ah, it's yeah. Now it's there. Can you see it?
Yeah, yeah. We can see it now. You can just go for full screen mode.
I
There's
can't see it.
There's one a symbol called as slideshow. You can click on that.
Well, it does say you are presenting to everyone, only I can't see it.
Yeah.
Where is it?
No, just right on top of your screen. There are 4 symbols: a save and next to it 2 more and one final one. On the final one, you just click. Right on top of your screen. Next to.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
I can't
Yeah, we
see
can
it.
see it.
Yeah, I can't see it. So how will I?
You can just talk. We can hear you. You can see, right?
Go to your slideshow.
Okay, can you see it now?
We can see, Rosie. You can just go through the slides one after the other.
Okay, I'll see it here on the side. Okay, so this is slide 1, then slide 2. Let's try it again. Hmm? Where it's supposed to come? It should be here now. Where is it? Then we just if you click on this. No. Hmm? I think I got it. Is it visible?
Not yet. Yeah, now it is just now visible.
It's coming, I think.
Just click on F5, then it will become bigger.
Full screen, yes, ma'am.
It's not coming.
We are
Ma'am,
able
click on
to
it.
see. We are able to see.
Ma'am, please
You're
click on it.
able to see it. Okay.
Yes, so you
Then,
just
Yes.
move the slides one after the other.
okay. Well, yeah, but I can't see the slide. So
You can just open it
What's
on your
going on?
computer, go to the PowerPoint and take it from
okay,
there.
okay,
This
okay. So
Meet window, you go to your PPT and you just start.
Yeah.
see the
You're able
slide,
One
Dilip
after
Ranade?
the other, we are getting it.
Can you see the slide? Dilip Ranade,
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
Kafka in
we
the
can see.
aquarium.
Yes, we can.
Hmm? Oh, good. So this is an Indian artist, Dilip Ranade, who made some paintings of Kafka, and he himself says he's quite inspired by Kafka. This, you see the blue, deep blue backdrop. It makes the picture quite uncanny, and of course the animal motive is there. Then this is the next painting, again by the same artist. It's called Franz Kafka's Fictional Logic, 2005. I like the other one better. Then this is a painting by the same artist, Dilip Ranade. It's called Freedom, but actually it's more about, it's a parody of freedom. You can say that we imagine we are free, but everywhere we are actually bound by society, by rules. So it's, I think the painting is very Kafkaesque in essence. This is from a review. This quote is from a review of the same artist. I quote, the forlorn, the surreal, and the darkness seen in Renade's paintings are all influenced by his heroes, Samuel Beckett and Franz Kafka. These influences have led Renade to a more figurative, abstract form of painting, with Kafka ever starring in his works. Life is logical chaos that cannot be explained, says this existentialist. Now, this is another artist, Rohit Raj Mendiratta. So he shows the narrative metamorphosis in three illustrations, black and white. In the first, you see the transformation into the insect, lot of zigzag lines, which refer to his mental state of mind, the turmoil, inner turmoil within him. And it's still the structure of the transformed being is still very round, full. And then in the second, it becomes distinct, the animal. You see a lot of, many of his umpteen legs, tiny legs as they are referred to. Just like the fairy tales, you always have the diminutive, tiny, small, the little mermaid. And then the third illustration, Gregor Samsa is dead. So the body is flat, thin, and you don't see any zigzag lines in it. This, of course, you will know this film, Anurag Kashyap's No Smoking. The actor, at least, you would know. So Anurag Kashyap was quite influenced by Kafka, at least in his initial days. This film, No Smoking, is a point of departure for the film is a short story, Quitters, by Stephen King. It's an American short story. Somebody is trying to quit smoking. In one interview, he was Anurag Kashyap was asked this question. The K, so the character's name is K. So this K, no smoking, is this a reference to Kafka or Kashyap? His answer was me. I don't want to die before my works get published. So this is a reference to Kafka's Last Testament. And also, Anurag Kashyap made this film Udta Punjab on substance abuse. And this film had problems with the censor board. Many of the scenes were censored. So he was very angry. He went to the courts, and in an interview, he's known to have said that his film is being subjected to the same trial that Kafka's Joseph K. was once subjected to. Then I come to Sarnath Banerjee, All Quiet in Vikaspuri. This is a graphic novel. Sarnath Banerjee lives in Berlin, and he is said to be influenced by Kafkan motives. I'm not sure how far it is true. I've read this particular graphic novel and I was not very convinced, but anyways. Then Zafar Anjum, he wrote this book, fictional book, Kafka in Ayodhya. I don't have to say what it's about. We all know what's going on. So Kafka visits the town of Ayodhya, and he takes with him Gregor Samsa. So what happens there? What do they experience? So this is the cover page of that book. And then there was another edition which has a different cover. This is the other cover. It shows Gregor Samsa. It's too explicit for me, but anyways. Then this is a book by Manisha Sethi, Kafka Land. It refers to the war on terrorism in India, with specific reference to Punjab, Gujarat, and Kashmir. So Kafka Land for Manisha Sethi is a totalitarian state. And then I have some news from various newspapers, because if you Google, then you see Kafkaesque in India. You see lots of newspapers, especially the Hindu, they do refer to Kafka. This is one news: Pakistani family caught in a Kafkaesque nightmare. Then another one: when reality triumphs Kafka's fiction. India can make even the most surreal happening look benignly like a part of daily life, and then it goes on. This is another news report: why I'm not interested in polls in Kashmir. So Kashmir is called the Kafka land with all the political connotations. Of course, most of these artists, they treat it as a very political writer, but as I see it, it's not just politics, it's also, he's also existential. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation, and I'm sure there are questions. So over to you, Ritu. Thank you. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Hello, Rosie.
Ah.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, good, good.
Thank you for the presentation. I think, in case you want us to see you, then you have to close the presentation.
Okay. Stop presenting. Okay. Is it okay now? Can you see me?
Yes, absolutely. We can see you.
Okay, good.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And are you ready to take some queries and suggestions or questions or comments?
Yeah.
All right. We have a statement being made by Nupur Sethi, which she says is a general question. And she says that when we know that an author belongs or is a precursor or a part of a particular literary movement, may it be existentialism, romanticism, realism, etc., don't you think that determination of the nature of literature makes literature a prejudiced practice and directs the reader to read a particular literary work in a defined way. Don't you think this practice is making literature prejudiced? So her question is basically the question of thinking that if you have a kind of literary theoretical framework and you look at a writing, then probably you've already begun with a prejudice, is her comment. So how would you like to look at that?
I think you're referring to a priori interpretations, that before you approach the text, you have already made up your mind what you are looking for.
Yes.
Yeah, so that happens very often. See, a scholar already has a certain approach to literature, a certain methodology, method. You may be have the psychoanalytical approach, or you may have the biographical approach, or you may be a structuralist, existentialist. So, yes, so, well, then I would just say read the text. Read the text with an open mind and do a close reading of the text, and then decide for yourself, because that's how I go about it. I focus on the text. I am in that sense Parthian. The author is dead, so you can say I have a certain approach, but then every scholar has to have certain approach. Otherwise, I focus. We should focus on the text. I feel that's the key to the understanding of the text, not in the life of the author, and not in preconceived notions that there's a father-son, so there has to be a father-son conflict, etc., etc. Yes, it is a problem. I don't deny it, but you have to face it. A close reading, to some extent, I think it can overcome that problem. Thank you.
I think I would also add to that particular statement, because when the whole point that she's bringing in is that when you put them into certain categories like existentialism or romanticism, you tend to read them from that angle. But I keep telling this to students all the time, that these kind of backdrops are something that we have created. We have told them that this is existentialism, this is romanticism. The writers never thought that they were part of it. And many of the writers fall outside that too. They're not only in that, they fall, for example, in contemporary times, we can go back and read at many of these writers from the idea of the agony and the anxiety that is being caused in today's world. Today, there's no existentialism, but we can use some of those concepts. So I think it is the mindset and the way that you read that makes the literature something that is extraordinarily interesting. And I don't think you should fall prey to this labels, because once you fall prey to labels, then you can't get out of it. So I think in some has led to that discussion. I think she's very right. Dr. Rosie is very right when she said that close reading is more important and enjoying the literature is more important.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and also that see, you are receptive to a certain kind of literature. You may like a certain kind of literature, you may not like another kind of literature. So, in that sense, your existential situation also determines what you like, what you don't like, so yeah, it goes both ways. Okay, next question.
She also has another query related. She says that Kafka's work has been analyzed by Benjamin and also by Deleuze. Just wanted to know the difference and similarity in the analysis of the two people.
Benjamin I've read, but the other scholar I'm not familiar with. So Benjamin, he's Benjamin. To some extent, he's he's enamored by Kafka as a, he just likes this author, although he was a, he was a leftist. So, and in those days, Brecht and all did not really, Lukács, they did not like Kafka because he was not really a working class proletariat kind of writer. But still, Benjamin wrote some articles appreciating Kafka, and he could relate with him. And I have a feeling also because they had both Jewish roots, so he felt some kind of empathy with Kafka. And I think there are at least 3-4 articles Benjamin had written on Kafka. One of them is in his book Illuminations. So it's difficult to pinpoint what exactly his approach is, but yes, he goes about it in a certain way, and it was that early reception of Kafka, not today. It's a bit different, I would say. Thank you.
I think it was more to do with also the point that both of them were trying to reread, and that's the important point, that writers might belong to a context in which they had written at one point of time, but how do you take them out and really look at them? And that's the important question that we should be looking at. So writers, do they become meaningful or not? And both Benjamin and Deleuze, I think, in their own way, were trying to reread Kafka to point out certain things that they felt worked for them in the context that they were looking at. So I think it is more a question of the text and the context that comes into play.
Now, excuse me, Deleuze you mentioned. I hadn't got the name, so I just now yes, I've read that book,
Yes.
Minor Literatures by Deleuze and Guattari. So
that's the one she was referring
to. So they are more interested in the political Kafka, and it's a more post-colonial approach where they talk about minor literatures that Kafka was writing. Was a German Jew in Czech majority area. So how does he go about it? But somehow I'm not very impressed by that book. So, I mean, I read it, but I really couldn't relate with it. So I prefer Benjamin, frankly speaking. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the next question that is by Amrit Mishra. He asks, how far do you think is caste an existential category?
Oh, caste, how can it be an existential category? Caste is you are born into a caste, and you're stuck with it. Whereas existentialism is highly individual idea. What you do with your life, the decisions you make in life, it's you are responsible for them. You're responsible for the mess you make in life, or whatever you make out of your life, and that is so. Actually, it's I would say it's the other side of caste, community, language, all these groups. It's the opposite of it. I hope I answered your question, Kalpana.
Yeah, I think so.
Hello?
I think so. Somewhere, the whole hack. Can you, Rosie,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Hello,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. No, I think you're right. Caste is not an individual thing. It is more to do with the community, and I think you're right. To bring in existentialism should come more from the fact that the human being there is in a particular caste is caught in a predicament because of the way that the whole community decides to exist or locate that particular individual. So it's more of a social factor, as you say very correctly.
Caste gives
Moving
you,
on to the next question.
okay.
Yeah. Caste.
Hello?
The next question is about Kafka's Jewish background. And it says that, do you think Kafka's Jewish background had a major influence on his writings?
Well, I can't give a straight answer, yes or no. Obviously, whether you like it or not, you are born in a certain setup, and he was a Jew, no doubt about it, but his writing is not about Jews. He is not writing about one group. So then he would be just a provincial writer. Why would I read him in India? Why would somebody in Africa read him, or in America, or Timbuktu or whatever? His writings have a universal element to them. Otherwise, if it was just Jewish, he would not be a world writer. So when it comes to writing, he is very discreet. The characters are not Jewish. Hardly there are 2-3 stories in which the characters are Jewish. Otherwise, they are just human beings. They are not. Writing is very discreet. In diaries, you do find some references to his Jewish background or to Jews as such, but then he's a cosmopolitan. He's not confined to his community. No. Yeah.
Can I quickly add?
But there is a statement. Yes, please do, Ritu.
Yeah, I mean, we are repeatedly getting these two kind of questions. One is the Jewish background, which is again repeated in another question, and the idea of caste. And we obviously do not see much relation between existentialism and these, but in a twisted manner, we can also say that one's context, be it that of being born in a particular caste, in a particular society where you get highly marginalized due to that, or be it a Jewish background in a certain situation where again it leads to further alienation, becomes the fundamental reason for an aggravated sense of angst that Dr. Rosie Singh has evoked. And in that sense, it becomes a vantage point from where your context of being there, being Jewish or being in a particular caste, then becomes the vantage point from where you can easily see the issues or articulate them better than others.
Yes, both things are true. It's not totally irrelevant, but at the same time, he transcends this Jewishness also. He's not, like I said, he's not just a Jewish writer. He's a writer per se. I would say even women writers, I don't like that, label. A writer is a writer. Once you call somebody a woman writer, it's like you have already, reduced her area of interest. So, yes, he was a Jew, but he was also a German. He was living in Prague in a Czech majority area. He was speaking, writing a certain kind of German. He was also a lawyer by profession. So, he had 3 sisters. So, all these things, how he experienced life, his place of work, his family, everything matters. But an author then, he takes all these experiences, and there is a lot of churning happening in the mind, and then a lot of churning and a lot of transformations, and then some story is written which is not about facts. It's more about, it's very different kind of discourse, literary discourse. Anyway, we can go to other questions. Yeah, Kalpana.
Next one is by Professor Jonas Raja, who teaches at Pondicherry University, and his statement is that a person's religious belief in some way or the other influences one's attitude. You said existentialism is an attitude. Was the existentialist attitude in the writings of Kafka the resultant of his Jewish belief? I think it is related to the question you were just answering. Did his indifferent attitude to the practice of the Jewish beliefs shape his metamorphosis?
No, at least in Metamorphosis, I would say it's not a Jewish tale. It's a family story. It can happen anywhere. It can happen in your house also. So it's there's nothing Jewish about that story. Absolutely nothing. And in so many stories, trial is not about, as I see it, it's more about accused, the courts, and the uneasiness, the angst that the accused feel, and lack of information and all that. But these are not Jewish motives. I mean, I don't read Kafka because he's a Jew. Then I can read so many other writers. Why only Kafka? No, I would not limit him to his Jewish background. No.
I know, I agree with you. The next question is, religions happen to offer answers to the question like, who am I? But where do they fail to provide a coherent explanation of the question, unlike existentialism? I think the question is based on religion.
Yeah, but religion it gives you ready-made answers. Whereas existentialism says you have to find your own answers in life. Nobody can help you, whether it's religion or any, fate or whatever, family or any group. You have to find answers in life. Religion cannot help you, because religion has fixed ideas. These are a priori values, and existentialism doesn't recognize a priori values. You have to make your own set of values. It's very different. In fact, Sartre was an atheist. So, and Camus also kind of indifferent to religion. So, I mean, each to his own.
We have Faizan Ahmad asking, as you said, there is no solution to come out of the miserable condition in Kafka's world. As every existential writer gives solutions, why Kafka does not give any?
Well, literature is not necessarily about giving solutions. It is this is what politicians do. They give you solutions, or they give you the illusion of giving solutions. Writers diagnose a situation. They diagnose the problems of society, and to that extent, I would say Kafka is also showing what life is about. But why should he show you the solution? You find it yourself. For Kafka, there is no solution. In fact, he cannot even end his stories. He's at a loss how to end his stories. They remain fragments. So I don't think that's the task of a writer, to provide you with answers. They throw up questions, they don't give answers. Yeah.
Okay. Then we have a question by Irvin Farugis. He says that, what about a person who would want to exist caste and cannot do so because of its fixed and restrictive nature? I think you have already pointed that out, because it's more a communal problem, and it's not a problem that is within the individual. So if you just want to quickly go back to that earlier answer, you can, or else we can move ahead.
Yeah, well, caste, it's up to you. You can throw away your caste or religion or whatever. These are identities given to you by birth. These are not what you have created. So it's up to you how you handle it. That's all I can say.
Then we have two interesting out of the general questions, I suppose, from what was based on your talk. Saurav Bharadwaj wants to know that it is an irrelevant question, but he would like to know that was it right of Max Brod to defy Franz Kafka's dying wishes?
As dying wishes?
Wishes, yeah.
Huh?
Dying wishes.
Dying wishes. Okay.
Yes.
Well, again, it's difficult to say yes or no. Frankly speaking, I'm grateful Marx saved those manuscripts, and otherwise today we could not have read Trial. It would have been just lost to the world. So in a way, I'm grateful to him, but I would still say stories is one thing, but somebody's diaries and letters are really private. So there I kind of I hesitate to say clearly that yes, he did the right thing, but I'm also selfish. I feel okay, what he did, it is because of him that I can read his works today, his diaries, his letters. So, okay, he betrayed him, but like the logic goes that if Kafka wanted to destroy his things, he should have done it himself. Why should he expect somebody else to do this work? So maybe he didn't really want it. That is also one argument. And the other argument is, of course, that he was not a famous writer, so it didn't really matter in those days to him or to his friend. But yes, the fame came later. So yes, a person does not want his private things lying around after he is gone. So well, if you are asking for my personal opinion, well, I am grateful to Max Brod. He saved the manuscripts. But yeah, but it's really a matter of opinion.
I suppose this is the last question, unless something else I've missed out. It says that could you please briefly discuss his discussions with Milne and Franz. I don't know, I lost the question somewhere. Yeah. Nature of Kafka's love with Milena and Felice. Was it Kafkaesque in some sense?
I've read his letters to Felice Bauer. She was his fiancée from Berlin. They had a kind of postal long-distance relationship. They didn't meet much, but they corresponded through letters. And the letters, there are thousands of letters. Kafka was quite crazy. He used to write sometimes 2 letters, sometimes even 3 letters a day, and then he would rush to the post office or the nearest post box, and he would. So he was quite a possessive lover, I would say, and he would. Actually, there you see the romantic side of Kafka, not the absurd side, but the romantic side of Kafka and how he writes letters. All kinds of things he writes. So that's the other side of Kafka. Milena's I haven't read, but Felice Bauer I've read. I wrote an article also on it, but they're very beautiful letters. And Felice Bauer had, like I said in last lecture, she had saved all the letters, even and kept them safely despite exile, despite moving from country to country. She kept the letters and she ultimately gave them for publication. So I think it was a nice relationship, but of course Kafka couldn't have married. He was so obsessed with writing that the thought of marriage scared him, and he was happy. He had tuberculosis, and he didn't have to marry Felice Power. So it's yes, but those letters are very nice. They are worth reading. Yeah.
Yes, we have just had one more statement, which I think also, in a way, is more of a summing up for you. The question is that, do you think from your study of Kafka, existential attitude that he interwove in his writings made them more impressive both then and even now?
Well, impressive, I don't know. You have to see the works in totality. It's not just from existentialist point of view. You have to see them in totality. And but yes, they do give a universal appeal to his writing, and that is why you can read him after 100 years also and relate to those works, because there is something contemporary also in it. There's something universal. So I think all good literature, great works of art are existentialist in essence. Because, I mean, what else should they be then, if not existentialist? I'm not sure if I answered your question, but anyways.
I don't think there was anything to answer there. I think it was more to do with the general nature of the movement and the ideas that came in from existentialism and how they seem to have an effect even in today's world, and how they also seem to make us understand that the predicaments, the anxieties, the fears that were there at another context are possibly true too today also, because of situations like the pandemic, because of this onus on the individual. I think in some way they are a reflection, and I think that's where the whole idea about the existential attitude that we talk about in these writings do become quite impressive, I think. And I think that's where I think you were very right in bringing in these notions. And also it gives us a kind of an experience that probably we are living in a world where meaning is something that we continuously strive to ask, what is meaning? And probably, for many of us, it may be difficult to understand and, probe into that question, because we're just living our existence with the day-to-day life and thinking this is meaning. But if you really start investigating, you may start having problems. So I think you were very right to point out to the stories that you brought in and the context that you brought in. And I'm really very happy that we had such a fruitful discussion. And let me end on that note and wait for the vote of thanks by one of our students. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I like to propose a vote of thanks. On behalf of the organizing team of this e-lecture series, I extend a very hearty thanks to Dr. Rosie Singh for sharing her valuable thoughts and opinions on existentialism. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure interacting with you, and I hope there'll be more such interactions.
Yeah, sure.
If you give a good feedback.
I also thank Dr. H. Kalpana and Dr. Ritu Kaki for their enormous cooperation in the organization of this event. Thank you, dear teachers. I take this opportunity to place on record our thanks to the technical support team of Pondicherry University, as well as my dear friends Harita Vijay Kumar and Jay Prakash for their support. Above all, I thank all the participants as well as the faculty members for their involvement and willingness to be part of our e-lecture series. Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Thank you. you, Leenu. I would just like to thank Dr. Rosie Singh on our personal behalf as well. She has been very patient with us. We kept changing the dates for inaugural and all numerous times, and every time cheerfully she would say.
I absolutely agree with you, Ritu. She's been a gem.
So thanks a lot. It was really a pleasure having you. And I believe the participants have benefited and all of us have benefited enormously from the discussions we had. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll be there for other lectures. Please keep sending me the link.
Sure.
And thanks a lot to the participants also for
Yeah.
their very interesting comments and questions, queries, etc. Thank you. And we will meet on the 5th of September.
September 5th.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.